So in this next segment, we are going to talk about how you measure behavior. And this is a little bit of a review. We have talked about some of the ways we can get behavioral measurement outcomes data before, so I'm just going to go over each type briefly. There are 3 ways that we can measure behavior. The first is direct observation, the second is indirect observation, and the third is self-report. So direct observation is just as the name implies. You are in real time observing a person engage in a behavior. However, this is only accurate and possible if you have a very strong definition of behavior. So the first part of this online lecture talked about the definitions of behavior. And direct observation can only work if you have access to participants. So while ideally we could always assess people engaging in the behaviors that we're interested in real time and in real context, this is most often not feasible. It's also very time consuming to collect the data. So if you think about it, if you are following somebody around or living in their house or in the school or in some part of their environment and either watching them engage in a behavior or recording them engage in a behavior, it's really difficult to take that observation data and change it into a quantitative, analyzable data set. So if you have a video of somebody eating all of their meals, a lot of effort will go into coding that video and determining what they actually ate, the quantity that they ate, and if they are adhering to a diet that you are wanting them to adhere to. Another issue that comes up in direct observation is how do you quantify partial behaviors, or do you? So going back to the example we talked about in the first part of the lecture, the condom use, what if you were able to get some sort of data, some sort of observational data of people using condoms, and you determined that they used condoms in about half of their encounters, or they would use condoms in all of their encounters but then use them improperly or take them off. How do you decide how to code that data? So ideally, you would want people to either engage in the behavior fully, so they used a condom exactly as you wanted them to, let's say, half of the time, or not at all. But when it comes to partial behaviors, it can be really tricky to figure out what to do with that data. And then of course it's really expensive because it's so time consuming, and if you're not doing it in person, then you're doing it in video, and you have to have really good video equipment. So on this slide, I have a couple links to different examples of direct observation measurement tools that I encourage you to check out. They're pretty cool. So the next way that we measure behavior is indirect measurement. So this is when we can collect data using electronic measures, or what I'm calling biobehavioral or biomarker data, and you can use them as kind of a proxy measure for behavior when we can't observe it. So we've talked in this class before about the use of pedometers or accelerometers, which are what are in Fitbits and that Heart app, the health app on the iPhone. We can have people use those, and so while we can't observe them moving through space or exercising, we can quantify it. We have these proxy measures that can quantify it. There's these cool tools that you can put on medication, prescription bottles that measure each time the bottle is open and closed. That can help us quantify that. We can get something like the number of refills of medication or bottles used. There's the Sense Cam, which I've talked before. So it's a camera that you wear around your neck, and this is also can be used as an observational tool, and it takes pictures like every 10 seconds throughout the day. Then we have the biobehavioral measurements. So these are, again, proxy measures to see if a behavior has occurred. So these could be things like blood glucose or different biomarkers. So if you are measuring diabetes adherence, you might want to measure blood glucose to see if there have been some sort of changes in behavior or measurement or adherence to medication that could be causing blood glucose. If you're measuring smoking, there's a salivary assessment that you can measure to determine whether people have smoked. You can measure people's weight or blood pressure. All of these different biobehavioral assessments can serve as proxy measures to see if a behavior has occurred. However, this is absolutely prone to error, and I bet you guys can guess why, because there are a number of different behaviors that can cause somebody to change physiologically. So just because somebody's blood sugar went down doesn't actually mean that they are adhering to their medication regimen that's been provided. They maybe adopted a different healthy behavior, and so unless you measure all other possible behaviors or causes of that change in blood glucose, you can't attribute the change to the behavior that you're looking for. So the third way that we measure behavior is through self-report. So this is the most commonly used, and it's the easiest and cheapest to collect, but it is subject to a number of biases. The first, that's not listed on this slide, is bad behavior definitions. So in the first segment of this lecture, I had you go over some examples and then write your own definition of behavior. So on a survey where you're asking people to self-report their own behavior, you don't define that behavior. It's going to be prone to error. There's also recall bias, so people cannot remember what they did a week ago, a month ago for some behaviors. So unless you're asking people to report what they're doing every day, it's going to be definitely subject to bias. And then also social desirability, which we talked about last week in class. People more or less know what they're supposed to be doing in terms of health. And so if they're part of a public health program, or you are part of a team of physicians or healthcare professionals that are asking them about their behaviors, people are going to know what you want to hear and they're going to want to comply with that. So it can be really tricky. So when you are using surveys or interviews to collect self-report behavioral data, you have to think about what we call the cognitive processing load that you're demanding of your participants. So I have a link here to an example of the NHANES survey used in the CDC's National Health and Nutrition Survey that we've talked about in class a couple times, and I encourage you to visit that because it's just interesting. But also I think one group, that lecture that we had where each group picked a different public data set, I think one group described NHANES, so you can go and visit our old discussion board where that's there for an example. But in terms of cognitive processing load, there's two ways you can look at it when you're using surveys or interviews to ask people to report their data. The first way is, are you asking people to remember something that's too complicated or that has occurred too far in the past? That's going to be subject to bias. But then also your measurement itself. So the way that it looks, the way that you word things, and the response options that you give people could cause you to get bad data. So here we have an example of a sedentary behavior questionnaire, and one problem with it is that it's a lot to look at, right? I get a little overwhelmed looking at it in the first place. But also, if you look at the response options, you may notice there's something tricky about them. I'm going to give you a second, see if you can think of any problems with these response options. Okay, so the problem that I see is that there are overlapping time frames. So it says 1 to 2 hours, and then it says 2 to 3 hours. So if I know that I watched TV for exactly 2 hours because I watched 4 episodes of a 30-minute program, I'm not really going to know for sure what box I should check. So that's another tricky thing. Also, the way that these questions are worded, these are behaviors that people might not be paying exact attention to. So how long you are sitting at a computer. I have a desk job, so chances are I'm spending most of my 9-hour workdays at my computer, but I don't know how many meetings I had or how many bathroom breaks I took or exactly, how much variation there was. And then also this question asks on a typical workday. For me, I don't have a typical workday. I have a schedule that varies a lot, and so it would be really hard for me to pick an average time that I was doing any one of these activities. So this is just an example of a survey that has a high cognitive processing load, and there's much worse surveys. I don't want you to get the wrong idea that this particular example is really bad. It's just one example, but these things can be really tricky. Another consideration in measurement is about the context in which a behavior occurs. So, does your behavior depend on who you're with, where you are, the weather, any other sort of external events? So, I am going to stop here and have you write another response on the discussion board and answer the question, why would it be important to measure the context in which a behavior occurs, and how can we measure context? So you'll stop here, you'll write your responses to those 2 questions on the discussion board, and then you'll continue with the third and final video.